this. So we are now recording. And I should be able to put this up on the IREJN website for people to find later and hopefully share with anyone. So welcome to our webinar on solar for houses of worship called Turning to Face the Sun. I want to thank our panelists who are presenting today, Bernie and David, as well as panelists who agreed to do this when we did it in person. We are hoping to reschedule this in the fall as an in-person event. There's an expanded slate of speakers with just a wealth of information and experience, so it will be great. And I also like to thank Lynn Fulkerson and the folks in Goshen who did so much work putting this together when we were all doing this as an in-person event. But thank you so much for being here with us today. It's going to be a very informative 90 minutes. So Bernie and David will each give a presentation. Please, you can submit your questions either via the chat button on the bottom of your screen or the Q&A. Ooh, someone has a Q&A already. And so that'll be a question. So what we'll do is we'll hold the questions till after the presentations, and then we'll go through them and we'll get through as many as we can by 6 o'clock. So thank you so much. I think that'll be great. Anything else, Bernie, David, anything else you wanna, did I miss anything? Usually I have to give directions on where the bathrooms are and to get more hummus, but we don't need to do that. I'm sure you know where that is. So again, thank you so much for being here, and we are recording this, so let's get going.
All right. So Terry, I'll share my screen and I'll commence becoming a talking head.
All right, that sounds good. I'm gonna stop my video so you don't have to see me.
So good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can see the screen. This is a presentation, as Terry said, with the folks from Goshen, Church of Christ Congregational. David is with Save the Sound. I am with People's Action for Clean Energy, and everybody is with IRGAN. Today, just to tell you what David and I and Terry hope that you'll take away is an understanding of your options to get solar and to become more energy efficient. Really come out of this with a set of next steps that you can take. So this shouldn't be one of those things that just disappears. Hopefully action will result of this, and a little bit of confidence that you can improve your carbon footprint even in this pandemic. And to start off, recognizing the challenges that houses of worship have. You have an unusual load patterns. Some just have energy use on the weekends or Friday or Saturday or Sunday. Others have daycares, others have schools. So it's not necessarily a consistent load pattern. It's something to think about. Many of the beautiful buildings, such as we would see in a place like Goshen, are historic. And unfortunately, often historic equates to not an efficient building. Not enough money. I guess almost everybody can say that that's a problem. There's wonderful people associated with houses of worship. Many times they're volunteers, and there's a lot of demands on their time and their expertise. The fact that you're a spiritual leader does not mean that you are necessarily skilled at becoming an energy leader. And while everybody on this call would love to be not taxable, in this arena of solar, it's kind of an impediment because of the way solar incentives work is that they're often forbearance of tax. And so the fact that you don't pay tax means that the forbearance of tax doesn't do you any good. So David and I are going to work a layered approach. We're going to kind of segment this out in chunks. Hopefully there'll be bite-sized chunks, and hopefully each of you will take a bite. Layer one, as you think about your house of worship, church, synagogue, mosque, first we're going to talk about how you evaluate your premises, and then how you think about reducing consumption. Layer two is the stage that everybody thinks about, which is solar panels and arrays and inverters. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then an important and often overlooked thing would be aesthetics. You don't want to take a beautiful historic church and turn it into something that looks like an oil refinery. Layer 3, as we said at the beginning, a challenge is congregations don't often have enough money. We'll talk about the 2 ways that you can work through that. No matter how persuasive I am and how diligent all of you are in taking these lessons to heart, the sad truth is the majority of people won't be able to get solar because of various factors that we'll probably talk about. And that's why David's presentation is so important, is there are other routes to getting green energy. So the fact that the panels aren't necessarily on your facility doesn't mean that you can't be a solar participant. And then I'm hopeful that layer 5 will be sort of a group action plan. I have a slide at the very end that can be the seed of that, but the hope is that we can develop some action steps and a support network. So let's get right into it. Evaluate and reduce. It helps to have like a little rhyming phrase. So with OJ, it was, if the glove fits, you must acquit. In my case, or our case, it is the mantra, reduce and then produce, which is to say, reduce your load first before you buy expensive solar systems to produce energy to power them. So how do we evaluate a house of worship, or for that matter, any building? Step 1, and it's surprising how many people don't do this, is gather together all of your utility bills, electricity, natural gas, oil, and of late, water, at least for some of us, is an ongoing expense. Another sort of a variant on that is, how many meters do you have? Those of us who think of ourselves as just individuals, like me, I have 1 meter. But if you are a large church or even a modest sized church or mosque, you might have a meter on your parking lights. You might have a parsonage. You might have several different meters within your main building. What rate schedule are you? I'm going to guess that the majority of the folks on the call don't even know what a rate schedule is. We will tell you. Take a walk around your building. Take a look at the shell. Are you insulated? Your windows and doors, are they from 1850? How much snow and wind and water comes through those doors? Figure that out. Have an inventory of your appliances. So that old faithful Frost King refrigerator that's been in your congregational pantry since 1990, it's been faithful, but it's an energy hog. And understanding what your draw is for your appliances and for your lights, it can sometimes yield surprising savings. Know the age of your heating and air conditioning systems. So some of that, especially the age of your heating and air conditioning systems, we're verging on getting technical right there. And so there's two really helpful programs that we have in Connecticut, really run by Energize Connecticut. I think for the majority of folks on the call, it will be the first here, SBEA, which stands for Small Business Energy Advantage. For some of the smaller churches, they might be literally in people's houses, and that would be a Home Energy Solutions Audit, HES. These are programs run by the utilities. For SBEA, you get a free energy assessment. Ironically, for the smaller facility, like a house, you have to pay $75, but it's well worth it. You'll get 5 hours with a couple people working through your house, helping you answer those questions that we posed up top. You'll end up with in your hands a comprehensive proposal that includes all your energy efficiency measures, materials, installation costs, and estimated savings if you actually take the steps. You might be saying to yourself, oh no, it's going to be a hard sell. It isn't. You can say no. You don't have to. They might give you 10 proposals and you don't have to take any of them. Some of them, though, might be very attractive. Especially with SBEA, there's not upfront cost for installed upgrades like installations. And in all cases, you get an incentive. So the cost of installation without one of these programs might be double what you pay in one of these programs. SBEA in particular gives you zero interest and low cost financing, and it actually can come to you on your electric bill, so it's just one bill. And oftentimes energy savings will pay for themselves, so that your bill inclusive of the cost of the upgrades will actually be lower than, or not much higher than, what you're paying now. And there is a 1-year warranty on contractors' parts and labors, and some people give you more than that, so shop around. So what is this rate schedule thing? This is just a screen print. There's a whole bunch of rates out there. Most of us on this call, certainly myself, we're rate 1. That's the residential rate. Small buildings, like where I am in West Hartford, our schools are rate 30. And when you're a rate 30, you have something called a demand charge, as well as a per kilowatt hour charge, which is actually bad for solar, and we'll explain why. Rate 40 is something that you have, either you have it or you don't. You can't get into it anymore. If you look at the bottom of the page, you'll see that you're grandfathered into it, but you can't get in. There's no new entrance into this, and that's a lot like rate 1, which is good for solar. Well, how do you know what rate schedule you are? What you do is you pull your electric bill, see in the middle of the page, a highlighted area. It tells you distribution rate 40. So this is a rate 40. The other interesting thing that I would encourage everybody to do is a little bit of energy detective work. So if you look at this bar graph on your electric bill, and I will take a guess and say most of us don't look at our electric bills, but there is a lot of information in there. So you can see here that the peak electric consumption for this particular organization, somebody sent me this, so I have no idea who this is actually, is in January. So where this individual customer's energy consumption starts to go up in December, January is the peak, February and March. My guess is that they have inefficient lights, and they probably have some electric space heaters or baseboard resistive heaters, and that's what's driving up the cost. So just, it might be, in some places, I would expect the opposite. I would expect less energy consumption during the winter and high during June, July, August, where people are spending their time air conditioning instead of heating. So there's some insights to be garnered just by looking at your bill. Engineering and aesthetics. So it really comes down to site choice and some considerations around site choice. You really have 4 choices: your roof, your grounds, your parking lot, and then, as David will be talking about, some new ones coming down the pike, the shared solar. So if it is your roof, or even for that matter, the ground, you have to think about shade. So oftentimes our churches have trees that are as old as the building itself, and people will say, I won't cut that tree down. If so, there's nothing wrong with that statement, but it might be the case that it precludes you from getting solar. Roof conditions. When you invest in solar, you're buying an asset that should last at least 20 years. There's the danger of meteor strikes, but that's relatively small these days. So if your roof needs to be replaced in 2 or 3 or 5 years, and you put a 20-year asset up there, you're really signing up for some extra misery that you don't have to sign up for, because in 5 years you're going to have to pay somebody to take the system down, re-roof, and put the system back up. I think you either want to wait to get the solar, or maybe accelerate your roof repair and replace. One of those. What roof are you talking about? Some people have a lot of roofs that they don't really think of. So you can put it right on the house of worship directly. How about a garage? Maybe on the parsonage, rectory, another building connected to your congregation. Another thing you're going to do if you walk around your grounds in your building and you say, oh, I'd like to put it over there, or I'd like one of those ground mount situations, you have to talk to your town's zoning department, because in my town of West Hartford, which is a relatively dense town, I don't know of a single ground mount, and I only know of one solar canopy. And I'll just say across, actually I have a lot more pictures coming up, so I'll pause. I won't go into these pictures at all. I would say another thing I would like everybody to think about is, once you've picked a place to put your solar, think about how it's going to look. So how it's situated, how jagged it is it symmetrical, and what type of panels are you going to put on there? Are you going to put on relatively inexpensive polycrystalline blue panels where you can see the aluminum frame? Or if it's going to be visible to the public, perhaps you should put on black panels where you can't see any of the wiring and frames. Let's just take a quick look at a couple different setups, just more or less to inspire to get your thinking going. On the upper left is a pretty well engineered solar canopy. You can, when I say it's engineered, you can see it's got cement blocks probably sunk into the ground with some pretty heavy steel. That's going to be an expensive option. Likewise, the one over on the right, you can see those are heavy I-beams, and that's a highly engineered structure. It's going to be engineered so it can handle a hurricane force wind, and that takes some doing, but it's definitely possible. Something down here is a lot more modest. I'm sure that it's engineered to specs, but it's probably much more affordable. A ground mount for the folks who are way out in the rural communities who might back up to an open field is highly desirable. It's relatively inexpensive. The panels can be oriented exactly the way they should be oriented. It's easy to maintain. You can go out and brush the snow off of them, which I don't recommend on some of the things I'll show you next. So ground mount is a great option if you have the grounds to support it. I give this person or this congregation A for effort, or A for ingenuity, I should say. I personally think they wasted a lot of roof space to make the point, but it is instructive. You can do stuff like that. I don't know if this is a Connecticut church. I don't think it is. This is a much more efficient sort of use of space. Notice here that you can see the silver frame, which the aluminum frame, and you can see the wiring on the panels. As long as this doesn't face an area where you're going to ruin the look of your building, I think this is a fine way to go. It's relatively inexpensive and it'll do the job. However, if you have a historic church, I think this is a much more elegant installation. You can see the panels are all black. If it wasn't for this little jagged area here, you wouldn't necessarily even realize that there are panels there. Also, the great majority of people are going to park over here or go by here. Most people, unless they know to look for it, aren't even going to see it. So hopefully, taking a look at those pictures, some of you are saying, I would like one of those. So how do we make that happen? Like Jerry Maguire, you're saying to yourself, well, show me how to do this. So solar panel systems are long-term assets, over 20 years of useful life. And step one is to do a little self-reflection. If you're going to enter into a 20-year commitment, it's a little bit like a marriage. You yourself have to be prepared to be a long-term partner. So if your congregation is moving or likely to undergo consolidation, physical acquisition is not a good choice, because you're going to invest in an asset that you're going to have to either find a buyer to take it or you're going to have to take it down. So there are three major ways to acquire solar: buy it, lease it, or enter into something called a power purchase agreement, also known as a PPA. Typically for us, houses of worship, for other nonprofits, outright purchase is not the way to go, because you will forego, it used to be a 30% investment tax credit. I think it's now down to 26%. So for the sake of discussion, if it was a $100,000 solar installation, if you are a taxable entity, right off the bat, $26,000 would come off of that. The other big solar tax advantage is you get to depreciate the system almost immediately. So you take that same $100,000 sample system and you say, oh, I spent $100,000 for an asset which I depreciate to zero. And I think it used to take 5 years to do that. I think they now do that even more quickly than that. What's good about that is that you get a $30,000 tax deduction. So that might be worth another $10,000 or $15,000. So because we are not taxpayers, the houses of worship and other nonprofits, all that means that we would end up, if we just bought it, we'd pay more than we have to. So how do we, I won't say get around that, but how do we work with that? The two possible ways that make sense to get solar directly are the lease and the PPA. There's a lot of words here, but that's okay. Essentially, in both the lease and the PPA, somebody else, a taxable entity, it might be an individual, more likely it's a company, they own the system. The HOW agrees to pay the owner fixed lease payments in the case of a lease, or to buy all the power at an agreed upon rate. That's the PPA. And just very quickly to go through considerations, and I do have a web link down below. I got this information from a website called Energy Sage, which is really a great source of all things solar, commercial and residential. I recommend this website. It's really worth your time. But term length, typically contracts, PPA and lease, are for 20 years. There are different terms, but 20 years is kind of a standard. Because you are not owning the system, because a third party owns it, the good news is that the owner is the one that has to monitor the system and make sure it is operating correctly and maintain it if it needs it. If you owned it, you have to take care of it. So for example, I own my solar system, and some years ago, my inverter was hit by lightning. I had to take care of that. And if you're a lease or a PPA holder, you don't have to take care of that. Everybody will give you a program to track your production, sometimes down to the panel level. It's a fun activity on a rainy day like this. I've discouraged you from buying the system outright, but within the lease and within the PPA options is what I think makes sense if you do want to buy it, because they typically have at certain dates and times a set of prices which, after they, the taxable entity, have taken the tax advantages, they're then willing to sell it to you for a much lower cost because they've already received a good chunk of the purchase price. So buyout clauses are something that you should look at, because that would allow you to buy the system at a reduced price. Just a couple cautions. If you're planning to move your congregation, to sell the building, if you're not planning to stay there for the whole 20 years, be very cognizant of how that transition is going to play in a potential sale. I'll just leave that there. At the end of, let's say, 20 years, when your agreement ends, you can either buy the system outright for almost nothing, have the leasing company remove it, or you can leave the system in place and renew the agreement with the owner. just to repeat a couple points on PPAs and leases, it really is a long-term contract, and one of the big values that they bring is they bring the money, so there's zero upfront cost in the lease and PPA option. But in exchange for that, you've agreed to either make the lease payments in the case of a lease, or to buy all the power that is produced. Most of the time, buying all the power that's produced is a wonderful thing because you get it at a discounted rate. However, in using this pandemic as an example of when that might not work in your favor, if your normal consumption, let's say, of electricity is 2,000 kilowatt hours a month, I'm going to bet you that in March and April of this year, it's less because you're probably not having too many in-person gatherings. So it's possible that if you had a PPA, you might be producing more power than you're going to be able to use in these months. Hopefully, this pandemic is not something that we have to face too often. I think that covers that. Just very quickly, and a shout out to Earthlight. It's a company out in Ellington. They've given me 2 samples, and they're okay with the churches being named. The Concordian Lutheran Church in Manchester, Connecticut. It is a rate 40. The current utility rate, and I'm not sure exactly when this was the current utility rate, but at the time this slide was produced, is 18 cents. As a result of the PPA that they got, they're paying 12 cents per kilowatt hour. So a savings of 6 cents per kilowatt hour. Over the estimated 20-year length of this transaction, they estimate they'll save almost $100,000. Just for reference, on an annual basis, this church used 62,000 kilowatt hours in the course of the year. And evidently in a year, looking back, the solar production was 62,820. So they almost exactly covered their consumption. And taking that 99,451 and dividing by 20 gives you a savings of almost $5,000 a month every year. Another example, Trinity Lutheran Church in Vernon, Connecticut. Current utility rate was 17 cents, which I know is different than 18 cents, and I don't know why. They got an 11 cent per kilowatt hour PPA price, and that PPA price will tend to go down with a bigger PPA because the fixed costs are less. In this case, they're saving $110,000 estimated over 20 years for an annual savings of $5,500 per year. And they have the option to buy this system out in year 7. So at this point, I think I'll say that perhaps 20, perhaps 25% of churches, mosques, synagogues, religious institutions are going to be able to buy a solar system outright, or lease it, or engage in a PPA that will contract with them. But that means that 80% or 75% of them won't be able to. And that's why David's talk is so crucial. There is an option that we all have, even without the option that David is going to talk about, where we can contract with a third party to buy what's called green power. You can go to this website, Energize CT, and in my case, using my home as an example, I pay a penny or two more, and my power is green power. You can all do that. However, what's really exciting is the fact that shared solar is finally, after a long, long time, coming to Connecticut. And so with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to David.
Greetings. Well, it's great to see you all. It's been a long time since I've seen you all. Okay, I'll stop with the jokes. I'll stick with my day job. So I'm here to talk about shared solar. And shared solar is a pretty exciting opportunity for people who would like to see us take some real action on climate change in the climate crisis, because it's geometrically larger than individual people putting solar panels on their roofs, and even businesses doing one business at a time. So I'm going to share my screen and start off with a presentation. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. And the questions that have been submitted we'll hopefully get to, especially the one about the pilot. I'm going to talk about the pilot projects a little bit later, and let me know if there's a more specific question using the chat or Q&A when I get there. So shared solar is now. It's been a long time. Many people have been fighting for it for nearly a decade. A lot of states are ahead of us. A lot of resources have gone to those other states, but we now have it. It's a modest program for starters, but we can make it successful. We can help make it successful, and in the long run, have a larger opportunity to make it possible for everyone who wants to have clean energy. So let's start in, and great. Trying to get my screen to work. One moment. There we go. Okay, so a couple of starting places. There's nothing specifically wrong with fossil fuels. They've been useful, but we now know that they cause a lot of harm in the climate, and also costs have gone up dramatically over time, even though they go up and down from day to day. So we really need to cut fossil fuels. Two main ways: efficiency. Bernie rightly mentioned those. And of course, if you haven't done those, do those first. The payback for efficiency measures could be 6 months or a year, or even less sometimes. So that's absolutely important. I've had 3 energy audits on my house, different houses at different times, and they've been invaluable, even though very different each time. But what we're really going to talk about today is renewable energy and how to expand them dramatically. And we're going to be talking about the new shared community solar law that's starting, and what we can do to move it all forward. And we don't probably need any extra urgency, but we do have people telling us that, reminding us that this is a high stakes game, and we really need to move a lot of balls forward if we're going to make any gains on the crisis that we're facing. So how are we doing with solar? Well, people in Connecticut are very positive about it. We grow more and more solar homes every year. We're at 41,000 now as of a few months ago. We go up substantially each year. Overall, same kind of thing when you add commercial and municipal. Not really, the state of Connecticut hasn't done much in terms of solar, but towns and companies and institutions have. So we've embraced solar using all the different programs that are available. The problem is it doesn't add up to much so far. We still have this dirty, risky fuel mix that's powering our electricity. And this is, we get our electricity from the regional grid. So these are the same numbers that pretty much everybody in New England has in their state overall. The big suppliers are natural gas and nuclear. That adds up to about 80%. Solar is down at 2%. And the question is then, how do we move this, how do we move this dramatically forward? Well, one of the consequences of having all of this expensive and risky power is that we pay some of the most expensive electricity rates in the country, whether it's residential or commercial or industrial. Over the last couple decades, we've been at or near the top of the state electricity costs anywhere in the country except for Hawaii and Alaska, which have their own situations. So this is a cripplingly high cost that is not well reported in Connecticut for probably more political than any other reasons. You know, sometimes the national business press is better on explaining that than our in-state press is. Solar, on the other hand, you know, this is an old story. The costs come down every year reliably, sometimes more than others, sometimes less, but the costs continue to come down of solar. And, you know, solar is only works when the sun's out and, or it's not nighttime. But so there's a lot of interest in solar storage, being able to store the solar power you produce in the day so that you can use it at night without having to draw on the grid, or when you have a peak demand moment. So there's been a huge amount of effort in making battery storage costs, bringing them down as well. And as you can see, they're coming down dramatically over the same period, the last decade as well. So in fact, there's a sort of a truism now that there's no need to build any more of those high peaking small gas units that are turned on at the very last minute when we have a peak moment of usage in the grid. It makes more sense to install solar with storage for those moments. So, you know, some people might think solar is, some people may still think solar is kind of a boutique power supply and, you know, only for the rich. Well, there's a really huge potential for solar to supply large portions of our power. In fact, solar just on rooftops could, in a technical sense, supply half of the 30 terawatt hours that we use in Connecticut each year. That's just about half of our power without clearing forests or using farmland. This is just rooftops. And this is the National Renewable Energy Labs, which produce all kinds of technical reports. And then looking a little further out to 2050, all of our power could come from renewable energy. And this is the Solutions Project you may have heard of. You know, you could quibble with whether residential rooftop PV is 4% or 5%, but it's definitely possible to get to 100% renewables if we start working on it now. And People's Action for Clean Energy, and Bernie and Mark Scully and others in that organization are working hard, going from town to town to start inventorying how energy is used and how it's consumed and what it costs now, and what changes can be put in place to get to 100% by 2050. All right, so shared solar, what's that? And why is it different? Well, first of all, it's a large solar array and many customers contract for the power. So you arrange as an individual, a business, a town, the state of Connecticut, a house of worship, you contract for a portion of the power that comes from that large array. And the savings, which are going to be over 10% off your standard bill, are automatically credited to your monthly bill. So Bernie's example of subscribing to energy supplier that charges a premium, you know, a cent more or whatever per kilowatt hour for green power, shared solar is the opposite. You'll spend 2.5 cents less per kilowatt hour for a bunch of reasons. And it's also true for other kinds of renewables, or what we consider renewables in Connecticut, fuel cells, our homegrown industry. So it's true, you could have shared wind, you could have shared fuel cells. Right now we're talking about shared solar. It's kind of right in front of us, but there are other options as well. So how does it work exactly? You know, the array that you're participating in is connected to the grid. You don't get the power from that array directly. As in any kind of electricity, the power goes where it's needed. So if it's produced down the street, it's going to be used down the street. And that's just the way electricity goes. That's the way power plants work as well. But a couple of special pluses with shared solar is that they're larger arrays than what you would have usually on a single business or on a single house. And the larger they are, the cheaper, because of those fixed costs that Bernie mentioned, the cheaper the power is going to be. And that's why shared solar is going to be cheaper than regular retail power or those green options that are now available. And second, distributing the production of power is really useful for supporting the grid. The utilities often embark onto large construction projects that are very costly they build substations and they connect up networks, circuits, so that whether in areas where there's been a lot of expansion of consumption and there's the potential for brownouts, that compensates. They have to do these large construction projects to compensate for that. Whereas the more power that's produced throughout the grid, instead of down in Waterford at Millstone and 3 or 4 other large places, the more the grid is supported and the better it stays, the less brittle it is, and the more intact it is, and the cheaper it is to maintain. So that's how shared solar works, and a couple advantages to it. Now let's get to the law that was passed after a lot of struggle. Public Act 18-50 passed in 2018. There's some good aspects, and then there's some limitations. Let's go down the good side. As you probably know, we pay through our electric bill every month into a fund that provides small grants, declining every year, for people who go solar. Well, people who tend to live in cities, tend to live in multifamily housing, tend to live in condos, cannot participate in those, have not until now been able to go solar. So the law has a tremendous bias in favor of bringing solar to low and moderate income communities. So 10% or more of every shared solar project the power has to be consumed by low income customers. An additional 40 or more percent has to be consumed by low income and moderate income customers, and low income groups that service low income people by providing services, housing authorities that provide housing and affordable housing developments. And also for the rest of the power, businesses, the state, towns, houses of worship are all eligible. It's very broad and open. Nobody can get more than 40% of the power. That makes it more like a co-op and less like a solo benefit situation. There's strong consumer protections so that there won't be the kind of exploitation and manipulation we've seen in the third-party power supplier market. And of course, there would be big savings, 10% or more. So here's some of the limits. It's a very small initiative. Many states have, when they put their foot put their best foot forward in shared solar, they've gone 5 or 10 times larger than we have. So this is a very tentative step forward. 25 megawatts for 6 years. Remember, in terms of customers already who've installed solar, it's over 300 megawatts. And for the 80% of us who can't put solar on our homes for one reason or another, we're only allowed 25 megawatts a year for 6 years, 150 megawatts total. We believe the demand for shared solar is going to be so great that we'll be able to go back to the legislature and say, hey, we need to increase this. Another limitation, if you're not low income or moderate income and fit into those 10% or 40% categories, you must show that you can't install solar at your house because you've got a bad roof or inappropriate roof or too much shade or something like that, or that you don't control your roof because you live in multifamily housing or in a condo environment or something like that. And that actually means you're going to have to get a letter from an installer who says, I went to their house, you couldn't put solar on their house, no how, or some other kind of proof. That's an unnecessary, needless restriction that was put into the law, and it would be great to get rid of that. Another restriction, so that does not apply to businesses, the state, towns, houses of worship, obviously. It's just residential folks who could be theoretically be putting solar on their roofs need to show that they can't, and in order to qualify for shared solar. Third, shared solar would be great if your average house of worship could put solar panels on the roof and share the power with the congregation. That's probably too small. The smallest is 100 kilowatts. That's probably a quarter acre or more. Fifth, it's complicated for developers. And sixth, utility, or I guess that's fifth, utilities have too much control in this overall environment. But the bottom line is it's a start, and we can make it work, and we can show how much we really want solar to take over. Here's a little bit more detail about what's actually going to happen, what's happened, and what's going to happen in the next over a couple of years. So last year, our state environmental protection department set the rules, and the utility regulatory authority set the rates and the regulations. So that's done. So starting this year, in January, a couple final pieces of decisions were made. Two of them are that the discount for shared solar subscribers is going to be 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So that's on an average customer, that's anywhere between $10 and $20 less per month that they're going to be spending for power off the standard rate that the utilities, the standard offer of the utilities. And then an important change was made, and I don't want to make too much of this, but it's significant that DEEP, our Environmental Protection Department, recommended and PURA accepted that the utilities and not the solar developers be in charge of signing up customers. The utilities have unparalleled access to customers everywhere. They communicate with us every month in our electric bills. They have all of our names and have a tremendous amount of demographic details. And it does make sense for them to be in charge. And it's a healthy, it seems to me to be a healthy turnaround that the state came up with this suggestion, and the utilities jointly held a webinar about a week ago that showed that they'd put a lot of thought and time and energy into how they're actually going to go about signing people up. And that could be a sea change. Utilities have been staunch opponents of the new wave of generating power, solar and renewables in general. And this could be a good, they appear to be taking this seriously at this time. So next steps, utilities will put out a sort of RFP that will describe all the decisions that have been made so far. Solar developers will submit their proposals in May and June. And there will be extra points awarded to projects that are sited on brownfields and on landfills. That's a good thing. There'll be points taken away if they decide the best way to produce power is by clearing a beautiful forest or using excellent farmland. And then the winning proposals will be selected in the middle of July or so, although that may change as a result of the health crisis. And then next year, we'll kind of start it all over again. The second year of solicitations and proposals will go out and be decided, hopefully in the middle of the year. The first year projects, the ones that are decided this year, will go online. And customers will start receiving power. Actually, the grid will start receiving power from the shared solar projects, and customers will start seeing those savings reflected on their bill in 2021. Okay, so how do you get ready for shared solar? There's lots we can do, and I would be remiss if I didn't say, well, you should Google Shared Solar Toolkit. if everybody does it right now, this is what you will see. The Save the Sound Shared Solar Toolkit is, it's about 6 pages. It's a lot more detailed than you'd ever want. And it's probably hasn't been updated in several months, so it might have some things that are not completely accurate, but it gives a ton of good information, and it's very useful. So there are 3 main things that you should do to get ready. 1 is identify some sites. 2 is recruit subscribers, and 3 is talk with developers. Well, the first and the third you don't really have to worry about very much. The hard part is recruiting subscribers, and that's why it's bold at the bottom of your screen. So let's just hit on each of these briefly. There are lots of possible sites for large solar arrays: brownfields, big buildings, parking garages. This is the JCC in Woodbridge, I believe, their carport, and then along highways. And this is somewhere in Massachusetts, which is way ahead of us. Plus, there are 250 closed landfills in Connecticut. So there are lots of places where we can put down solar arrays that become shared solar. The most important thing, really, though, is that we can all do is start recruiting subscribers. Now that we understand how it works and how many people are, potentially benefit from it, 800,000 potential subscribers, 290,000 customers that are below 60% of the state median income, according to the utilities. And the only restriction really is that the array and the customer need to be in the same utility area. So if you live in Bridgeport, your array needs to be in the sort of Bridgeport, New Haven area served by United Illuminating Avangrid. Of course, Eversource covers a large part of the state. And so your grid, your array that you're participating in could be in Stonington, and you could live in Litchfield, and that's perfectly okay, because the credit on your bill is done electronically by computers. It has nothing to do, you don't receive the actual power. And now, so where do you find subscribers? If you could put together a group of people in your church, synagogue, mosque, etc., who say, yeah, I'd be interested. Let's go talk to some developers. If you could pull together folks in your neighborhood, folks in your tenant association, some businesses grouped together, that does a lot of the work, the hard work of recruiting subscribers for you, takes that out of the utilities' hands or anybody who's doing the recruitment, and brings down the cost of shared solar, which is in all of our interest. So the third thing you can do is connect with developers, and here are some suggestions. There was a pilot project that passed as a result of 2015 legislation. Nothing that any of the people wanting shared solar were in favor of. We all thought, nope, we're ready, no need for a pilot, but there was a pilot. And it's moving along well in some areas and not in others, to respond to Gary's question. So the middle one, Town of Bloomfield, we're going to talk about for a minute, and that is up and running. The other 2, I would say, the one in Shelton is in development, and the one in Thompson, I have very little information about personally. The timing all the way in the right-hand side is clearly wrong for all of those. So let's look at, there are a number of reasons that are probably too detailed for this conversation why the pilot projects are behind, but let's talk for a minute about the one that is in place. The Bloomfield Shared Solar Pilot, it's on an old landfill site behind the Board of Ed building. The subscribers include the Board of Ed for its school buildings, some other town facilities, don't know if it's the police station or the library, whatever, a couple of low-income housing developments, and then the rest of it, 20%, or other residents, some in Bloomfield and some in other towns. And as long as they're in Eversource territory, they can subscribe. And so that's a real success story. A shout out to CTEC, a good Connecticut company that has done a lot of reliable work in the state. They built it. And a shout out to Clean Energy Collective. That's the part of they did the work of communicating and recruiting subscribers and explaining how it works and signing people up. And they're really, they're based in Colorado, and Colorado had shared solar in 2007, partly as a result of the efforts of Clean Energy Collective, which gathered it, went to the legislature and said, hey, solar is going to continue to grow slowly unless we can allow people to participate in larger arrays together. So they're really at the very beginning of shared solar, and it's great to have them finally active in Connecticut. Ameresco now owns the project, but that's bought it from after CTEC built it. And so let's look at the impacts. First of all, people are saving a chunk of money. They're paying 10% less than they would if they were on the standard utility rate, and they're having a great environmental impact. It's the equivalent of, not driving 4.5 million miles or planting 31,000 trees each year, not putting 4 million pounds of CO2 into the air each year. So this is good news, and it's a glimpse into what could happen if we had 20 or 30 projects like the Bloomfield one up and running. All right, so what we want to have is full statewide share renewables so that everyone has access to clean energy. That's our goal, and we think that working together we'll get there. So let me just that's it for me, and I'm going to unshare my screen and check the chat just to see if there's anything I should answer before I turn it back.
Hey there, guys. So I'm looking at the Q&A, and so you already answered the question from Gary on how is the test in Connecticut coming on shared community solar, correct?
Unless he has more questions, then go ahead and ask more, Gary.
Let me see here. Yeah, so Gary, if he answered your question, just let us know, and if you have a follow-up, you can totally answer. You can do that. And so Davida said, would you discuss the distance a set of panels can be away from a building to be effective? In other words, what about line loss?
I can take a non-specific shot at that. What David is referring to is the farther they are away, the more electricity is sort of lost going through the wires. It's sort of the equivalent of electrical friction. So you do want a ground mount system in particular to be as close to your house of worship as possible. I don't know the technical answer to that. I know some of the people who I can see are on the call. They might know. There are some things you can do which increase the gauge of the wire, and I think where you position the inverter can also alleviate some of that. So that's the extent that I can answer that. It's a technical question.
Thank you. And she also said she's working with the historic district commissions. What grounds can they use to deny an application?
I'll take another non-specific shot. That's a really good question. I don't have any immediate experience myself. I'm reviewing a document, which if I find it has a solar section, I can pass on through you, Terry. I also would say the thrust of this document, as far as I am through it now, is that these historic commissions have latitude, and sometimes their latitude is predicated on their attitudes. They're made up of human beings, and so sometimes these human beings can be very open to something as long as they construe that they don't want to ruin the historic nature of a neighborhood, but they're open if you can't see it or if it's meets certain design standards. And other people would just be out of the box opposed to it. So I know this isn't a historic district issue, but I know there are certain like condo and homeowners associations in Connecticut that just as a matter of course are opposed to anything that looks different. So that would be an extremely intransigent, against it. Conversely, I think there are plenty of forward-looking groups that would be for it. So I know that's a wishy-washy answer. I think there's a fair amount of latitude, and I think there's a fair amount of influence that you might be able to exert on sort of seeing where their minds are at and finding some examples where you have a historic commission that is open to it. And one final point, I know some people who work on historic buildings often bemoan the fact that historic structures are taken down because they're not economic, in the same way that many people, as David referred to, don't like farmland to be taken up by solar. But there is a sweet spot, namely by putting solar in connection with a historic building or with farmland in the right mix, you improve the economic viability of that farmland or that historic building. So it can be a win-win, if in some cases anyway.
So I have a couple questions about shared solar that kind of came in together. So I'm going to put them all together. So one is, sorry, let me find it again.
Great questions.
So yeah, so we're getting a lot of great questions. Thank you so much. Can a house of worship join in shared solar if they're able to have solar on or near their building? So that's a first one. And then another one that's related is, could David speak more specifically on the first steps a house of worship in the Hamden area would start to start the process of getting into shared solar? And that's fairly related to, I think, Peter's question, which is sort of similar, the same question, but more specific to that pilot site in Shelton. When can houses of worship start to sign up for that?
So let me try to do one at a time.
Yeah.
So they're really, let's put the pilot aside for a minute. There are really two ways that a house of worship, a congregation, a community of interest of any kind can do shared solar. One is go look for a developer and say, hey, we got 20 families, we've got 60 families, 60 customers or whatever, who are interested in this and would like to talk to you. We're shopping, the different projects that have been approved, and we'd like to sign up with one of you. That has to wait until July, until they've been selected, and it might even be a little bit later because of the crisis. But that's one way, is to sort of group yourselves together as subscribers and approach one or more of the developers that have been approved. Second, you can say, hey, we've got this 3/4 acre site that we can't find another use for, or that this would be a great use for, or we've got 2 acres over here, or we have maybe a parishioner who's willing to donate a 5-acre site. You could more than theoretically, you could actually say, we'd like to develop, put a solar array up ourselves and become a producer of power, and in a partnership with a solar developer who you would absolutely need, unless you have amazing technical expertise within the congregation, and become a producer. And then also, if you want, be a group of subscribers to that same or to other. So you could go the production route, but it's a pretty big deal. It has to, at this point, it has to be a pretty large system. 100 kilowatts is, you need 5 acres for a megawatt, so it's probably at least an acre or so full of solar arrays. So you could do that, but it's more likely you'd want to go the route of grouping your community of interest members together as subscribers.
So Lynn Fulkerson has a question, Bernie, I think for you. How can we check the reputation and or the reliability of a company that offers a solar lease or PPA?
That's a great question. Actually, I have one last slide, which I'll show in a few minutes, but I think part of the answer is really IREJN, which is to say, not Terry Eichel, opera singer and solar installer. No, it would be that I think we can serve as a point. People who belong to IREJN might be able to get together and say, we worked with Earthlight Technologies, or we worked with Waldo Renewables. Those are two people who are on the last slide that I want to show. I'm not singling them out as great, but somebody in our group knows how their experience was. So that's answer one, is we can begin to form a community of people who are engaged in this, and we can share our experience. I think that'll do two things. We'll find out what their past performance was. And secondly, if an installer is going to engage with a congregation and that installer knows that that congregation is really part of a big group, they're less likely to pull a fast one. Because the other thing I think it's worth just Googling. A lot of legal proceedings where these things might go wrong would be findable online. And I think it's always a good practice to check with the Green Bank, who has seen all of these installers with their residential installations. So
absolutely. And I'll say, when we were planning this larger expanded slate of speakers for the in-person event, one of the people we had speaking, and maybe two actually, were both folks that had helped their organization get solar. So they were going to also talk about their experience with that installer. And so that's always helpful. We try to include that sort of first person perspective and experience when we're talking about this, because it is so important and makes such a huge difference. Let me see if there's anyone. Gary asked, my town building is right next to a lake. Is there experience in this area with water mounted systems?
China's doing a lot of it. I don't know.
it's certainly, I know we probably have all seen the same pictures. In Japan, there's giant floating installations. I believe I saw, like in Clean Technica or one of these publications, that there are some in the United States. I have not seen nor heard of any in Connecticut. It's not to say it's not possible, but nothing that I know.
Jean had a question. If we do an inventory of sites in our towns, is there a list of shared solar developers?
There is, as part of the shared solar toolkit, there's a list of shared solar developers, or rather solar developers who have indicated interest in becoming shared solar developers. It's a long list. You know, some big ones are on there, like CTEC that I mentioned, and Clean Energy Collective, which is more focused, less on development, more on the subscriber side. But that would be one place to look. As Bernie mentioned, the Green Bank has a lot of experience with solar developers, and I think there are some sort of approved, you know, or highly rated developers on their list. I don't know exactly how to get that list, but you know, I think anybody who's got personal experience with a solar developer, and they're not a very, very small solar developer, would be a good place to approach. A lot of the small ones want to stay small. Medium and large, they're interested in doing big arrays through shared solar. They may be interested.
Lynn had a follow-up question. Does the installer always offer the lease or PPA, or is it sometimes a third party? Bernie, this is for you.
Yeah, both. So not always, but the two folks that Earthlight and Waldo Renewables, and I call them out because they just helped me with my presentation. So I'm not elevating them beyond that. But in both their cases, they themselves are that third party. They created a PPA themselves. But you can also get a PPA through the Green Bank. So, and not every installer will offer it, but at least the two that I've cited do.
So there's a New Haven shared solar question that I want to address.
Yeah, though, is it the Wallingford one?
No.
Or, oh, right, Bettina. Sorry, it's up there.
So just to be clear, that was not the same kind of shared solar there that we're talking about here. That was really sharing in the investment in the solar array that was being put up to benefit Columbus House. The only shared solar that's been permitted has the 3 pilots, only one of which is currently operating, and the future ones that will be approved, you know, in the middle of the year. So it's a different animal. They did unfortunately use the same name, so there's some confusion there.
Okay, so Bettina's comment was there is a group in New Haven that shared a solar array with Columbus House, a small project yet shared. And so what David is saying is that they basically share the investment, but they're not sharing in the power.
Correct. You cannot share. You become a power producer when the power crosses a right of way, leaves your property, and that makes you a utility. And that's why shared solar is such a different animal from, producing power for yourself at your home.
And so Peter said, he said, I read about a solar pilot program being started in Wallingford on a landfill site, which surprised me since Wallingford has its own power generation company. Do you know any more about this? It is close to us in Hamden.
Yeah, I do not know more about it. Wallingford, along with 5 other towns, have municipal power, cheaper, more responsive to usually to local control, nonprofit, and in many states that's the norm. In Connecticut, we mostly have these 2 investor-owned utilities dominating the utility market. I think there are 30-something municipal power companies in Massachusetts. But I digress. I wish we had more public power. But the shared solar law really does not address and does not compel the municipals to do anything. So there may very well be some kind of shared solar project there, and I don't know about it, and it wouldn't be regulated in the same way, certainly, as the industrial utility ones.
Okay.
So that's good news. I'd love to hear more about that.
Jean said, is there any technical / legal help for a congregation to form a cooperative to own the congregation's, I guess, power plant or own the solar array? And I want to actually tack on a question, is that my dad, who is on the board of trustees at my church, was looking into forming some sort of LLC so the church could buy the solar array outright and get the tax credit. And we just, we didn't go through, but is that possible? That was sort of his idea.
I'll take that. The people that I would refer you to would be the Unitarian Society of Hartford. I've got Jeff Howard as the point person on this slide. If you don't mind, I'll share this slide. But they actually have, I think, a 30 kilowatt system, ground mount system, and it's owned by 2 parishioners, a man and his wife, David and Gloria Newton, I think is their name. And they've done several presentations and are very proud of what they've done, and are more than willing to take you through the substantial machinations of the tax law and the accounting process that you have to go through. So in other words, what sort of individual do you have to be the owner? What's the arrangement between you and the congregation? So it is possible. And if you are thinking of that, so Terry, I would urge your dad to talk to them, and Jean, I would say you should definitely speak to them as well, because it's a difficult path and they have blazed it. You might want to take a turn different than they did, but I would start with the work that they've done. And they, like I said, they really are very good about talking about it.
So actually, if you don't mind me just breaking in real quick, there we have someone on the chat named Franz, who I actually don't know, but he says, if churches are interested in creating, financing, building, and running their own solar projects, they can allow parishioners and the public to invest in the project and co-own the benefits. And Franz is from a group called Raise Green. So, and he said they can help. So their website is raisegreen.com. So that might be for everyone who's on, worth checking out. I don't know the group, but I'll definitely go on the website and look after this, because I know that definitely there are congregations that are looking into how they might be able to take advantage of the tax credits the way Unitarian Society of Hartford did, and especially when Jeff led that effort at USH, it was sort of the first of its kind, but I think it's becoming a bit more common now.
And Terry, if I could jump on, I know Franz, and I know we've had several discussions with cool. Raise Green, and every time we see them, the power of their platform increases.
Oh, great.
They're substantial advisors. I think that Columbus House in New Haven might have been, I'm not 100% sure, but might have been their handiwork. And among other things, they are a crowdsourcing finance mechanism. So whereas the Green Bank
Right.
would be like a bank, like a typical bank, like we all know, they are sort of the modern edge of financing, crowdsourcing. And you can apply them to solar, you can apply them to all sorts of different projects.
Oh, that's awesome. That's great. Okay, that's terrific. Thank you. Well, I'm glad that I don't think I've met Franz before, but great. Don said, I noticed that wind provides about 4% of energy in Connecticut and solar is about 2%. Any comments about the role of wind? And then his second question is, has your group considered the role of heat pumps?
I would defer to others about the heat pumps, but let me start with the wind. First of all, it's the regional grid. It's that we get our power from. So 4%, it includes windmills in, New Hampshire, Maine, and everywhere else in New England, and any wind power that might be purchased from outside the region as well. That's why our hydro is so high, is relatively high, not because we have a lot of, low head hydro from people's backyards or the Connecticut River Dam or something. It's because we purchase it from, hundreds and hundreds of miles north in Canada. And also wind has a higher capacity factor than solar. So if the wind blows, basically the wind blows more than the sun shines. So 25% of the time, a windmill is producing power, roughly 15% of the time, solar panels are producing power.
I'll jump on. And of course, wind is going to increase very substantially. We all know we've leased or procured 2,000 megawatts of offshore wind for Connecticut, and that's going to be, I think, roughly the same once you factor in the capacity factor that David referenced. I think that will be on the scale of one of our nuclear reactors. So it's a substantial amount.
It matches what Millstone creates, basically.
Oh, so maybe both of them then.
Except that the capacity factors for Millstone are, much
like 99%. Yeah.
Right.
And heat pumps would take us off of our target, but I will say that my group, PACE, People's Action for Clean Energy, has a campaign that we started called Heat Smart Connecticut. It's patterned after in-flight efforts in Massachusetts and New York, where it's been going on for years. We basically work with NYSERDA and Mass CEC, and we've sort of started our own program here. We are working, hopefully, with the town of Branford. It's going to be patterned after the Solarize model. It'll be a community outreach sort of campaign, education, and a group buying capability. But it is, to be clear, it is not a generator of power. Some people hear about geothermal power. This doesn't generate electricity here. This would replace your furnace or your wood stove or something like that.
So great, thank you. Janet asked, our local school has solar. Is it even possible to convert an existing system into a shared system?
I believe that the legislation, I remember, but I would have to check to be sure, that the legislation only applies to newly constructed.
Okay.
But I'd have to check that to be completely sure.
All right. Davida said she lives at Seabury and Bloomfield, and they have solar and heat pumps, and this winter they did not even need to turn on the boilers. So
way to go.
Exactly.
That's the dream with heat pumps, by the way.
Yeah, it really is.
Terry, can I go back to Peter's question away?
Absolutely.
Back? So Peter says, I talked to a nice lady at US Solar about the pilot site in Shelton. That's great that you did that, by the way. You reached out. And their recruitment efforts would be focused on low and moderate income residential users, and nonprofits might follow. Your presentation implies the utility will do the recruiting instead of US Solar. So that is true for the non-pilot projects. The pilot projects will be done, as she explained, that they are recruiting the subscribers. In other words, the solar developers are recruiting the subscribers in the pilot projects, including the Shelton one. So stay on them, because they will need, low and moderate income, and as just like the Bloomfield site, a whole bunch of people. And let me tell you, as somebody who is helping Clean Energy Collective, just in a friendly way, identify subscribers, they were handing out $100 incentives, gift cards at the end, because people really didn't. It's a new concept, and from Colorado, they're having a lot of trouble finding people. So that last, 60 or 80 people, residential customers, they're probably going to be very glad to have a house of worship or many individuals in the congregation step forward and say, hey, I'm interested, as opposed to having to find them somehow. So stay on them, and good for you for reaching out and stick with it.
So Lad had a question. David, for you, when does shared storage become reality, and what is a potential reduced cost?
I was hoping I wouldn't have to answer. I don't know the answer to that question.
Sorry.
But no, it's what we know is true, is that it doesn't make sense for utilities to be planning to build these peaking units to produce power at in July 13th at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when it's splitting incredibly hot and everybody's air conditioners are on. It makes more sense to plan storage projects, but those are big projects, and those are the most expensive power plants that are being replaced. The cost of storage is coming down steadily, but I don't think we know when it'll become cost effective to have solar, to supply a solar storage unit along with your solar panels. But there are utilities that are providing, and one in Vermont I can think of, that's providing 2/3 of the cost of installing the storage in a residential situation, in exchange for the ability to call on that storage at moments of peak usage. So the home has solar panels on the roof, and instead of sending all their power back to the grid when there's a surplus, when they're producing more than they're using, some of it goes into the batteries. So the batteries are always topped up, they're always full. The utility, for the price of its 2/3 purchase of the cost of storage, is able to withdraw power on demand from those units. And we should note that a piece of legislation that went through in Connecticut, I think in 2019, allows the utilities to rate base, that means to acquire and earn a profit on storage, which is the first time, except for those very small solar installations, that they have been permitted to build and purchase and own. It's the first time that they've been allowed to do any generation or anything like generation since deregulation happened in 2000. So some people would say that's a good thing, because the utilities are now invested in solving the problem that they always point out with solar, which is what happens at night. We have to compensate the utility. It's so unfair. The utilities have to operate as your big storage facility.
So Gene actually has, I'll have this be our last question of the evening. He says, will the July pilot customers be solicited by the utility or the developer?
The developers submit proposals. The proposals are selected by the utilities with the input of DEEP, the Environmental Protection Department. And some of the criteria they're using, they are affirming they are going to keep confidential, which is maddening, and it shouldn't be the case. But
the pilot customers will be solicited by the utility once the locations are.
Did you say pilot? I'm sorry.
Yeah, he said, will the July pilot customers be solicited by the utility or the developer?
Okay, I'm not.
I'm not super clear on the question either.
July, the pilot customers will be solicited by the developers.
Okay.
That is the Thompson one is sort of self-contained. The Shelton one is US Solar, and they will be soliciting subscribers. The ones that are chosen in July will be solicited by the utilities. The
Okay,
customers.
perfect. Okay, I think that's very clear. And then also, I'm just gonna, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Bernie. Thank you, David.
Sherry, could I
This
have 20
was-
seconds?
Hmm?
Could I have 20 seconds?
Oh, absolutely.
20 seconds. So this slide that I have up here, I know there are people on this call, I remember the names, who have a lot to offer. And so this is not meant to be an end all be all. This is meant to be a seed. So I would say let's build a support network together. So if your congregation has solar and you're willing to be a representative for other people, I'd like to have call it a speakers bureau or some sort of group like that, where you could say, hey, we're thinking about this, and some of the questions that Lynn Fulkerson asked. It'd be great if she could say, yeah, I've talked to 5 other people who've been down this road. I think that's something that we can do from between PACE, IRAGN, and Save the Sound. I think we
Absolutely.
can work on working together. And I'll just say real quick, David, I know over in Kingston, there was going to be a natural gas peaking plant, and that plant was replaced by a very large solar storage facility. So it has happened. I don't know what it took to make that happen, but it is beginning to turn that way.
That's awesome.
And thank
So
you.
I will, so thank you again. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Bernie, for this. And yes, and I'm going to send out, if people want to follow up with Bernie or David, I'm going to send out a email with the links that they've included, plus their contact information in an email through the Eventbrite site that you all registered on. So you should get that. And I also just wanted to sort of end with Nancy said that she had an experience working with her historic commission, where the First Church of Christ Congregational in Guilford, I believe, had to do a lot to convince them. They were initially very resistant, but then ultimately thanked them for raising awareness and voted for their plan. So I thought that was a nice positive note that we just need to keep working forward, educating people with grace and kindness, but also, determination. So thank you, everyone. Have a great night, and you'll hear from me soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And yes, I'm going to hopefully be posting this recording to someone who just asked. So thank you. Have a good night.
Good night.
Take care, David.
You too.